Viena tehniska detaļa, kāds no mūsu.
One technical detail. Someone asked whether we will have lunch. Yes, at 12:30 we will have lunch for an hour downstairs. Let's continue. Our first speaker is going to be Iveta Kažoka, director of Providus, and she's going to talk about one survey and research what we have conducted. Before elections, we do like to talk about what we imagine is necessary for electorate, whether the electorate is influenced by media or not. Usually these are just assumptions, and that's why we are especially very glad that we have conducted these post-election surveys, and I'm not going to talk in great length about this. I'll give the floor to Iveta Kažoka. Thank you, Gunta. Thank you, everyone, especially those who are still standing in the last rows. We have some chairs summoned up from downstairs. It is a great honor to have you in such great numbers and to be a co-organizer of such an event. And I know that some people have come here first of all, to learn experience of other countries protecting their elections, as well as understand what has happened during our elections. Now I will come up with my speech for about half an hour on a very detailed survey that we have conducted through SKDS Center, in order to understand what has happened in Latvia. And the political context before and after election is a very clear wish for change in the society of Latvia. And for many voters, it was a heavy choice to make. And here we can see visually what has happened on the 6th of October, namely 3 political parties that have been the leading coalition were moved to place 5, 6, and 7, whereas 3 new political parties got the first 3 places, which indicates that there are great changes in the politics of Latvia. And what our survey outlined, namely that those changes have been even more dramatic. And it turns out that the majority that previously voted for old players voted for the new players, and many changed their choices. It turns out that National Apvienība had the votes of Vienotība, whereas many who voted for Vienotība this year previously have voted for National Apvienība. That is true about everyone, every party, but except for Saskaņa. So this was a great movement of our electorate, and we were trying to understand why by asking people very harsh questions. Do you agree that any changes in the politics of Latvia are better than no changes at all? And I was very surprised by the answers. It turns out that 68% of all the voters were saying that any changes would be better than no changes at all, and only 19% do not agree to that. And if we look party by party to the same question, namely 10 most popular parties, most voters for those parties agreed to this assumption, to this affirmation that they want some changes at least. On the contrary to no changes at all. It is true especially for KPLV, and less people agreed to this affirmation from Latvia's Krievu Savienība. So people want changes, and there is no precedent for this in the past. And one more thing, what is interesting, when looking for those changes, the voters decided on their choice relatively late in the tunnel of elections. So when we asked people in June, July, people were non-decisive, or they thought that they are going to vote for their old choices. But it turned out that two-thirds changed their votes in the very last minute, or very close to elections. But here we can see some ethnic peculiarities, namely Latvia's Krievu apvienība and Saskaņa and Latvia's regional apvienība. They were rather stable in their choices, and they didn't change their votes in the last minute. But most Latvian voters, those who voted for the Latvian parties, they changed their minds in the very last moment, indicating that they could have been influenced at the very last moment. So that's what we can see. The people made their choices very late. And what else we learned, that these elections were especially hard for the majority of voters. It is especially true for those who voted for Vienotība 4 years ago. Here we can see ethnic division, namely those who vote for so-called Russian political parties. For them, this choice was not so hard, whereas the electorate of Attīstībai par or Jaunā Vienotība, these elections were especially difficult. Another interesting question that we asked in order to understand what happened on the election day, what will be the likelihood that these people could have voted for another political party at the very last moment. And here are the results. Namely, when we asked the voters if you had a second vote, which other party you could have voted, and those are the responses. Jaunā konservatīvā partija and Attīstībai par could have received double votes if a second vote were available. And if we look at the second, third, fourth choice of the electorate, then we can disclose even a paradox, namely that the ideological stance were not the decisive. Those who voted for Jaunā konservatīvā partija could have voted even for Attīstībai par or KPLV. So in the minds of our electorates, one party could have been substituted by the other, and this was on very gigantic scale. And another interesting thing, that in the minds of the electorate, the choice had to be made between 10 parties, not between 7 who got into the parliament, especially regional party was very, very close to this 5% mark to be elected. Which means that if we assume that there were elections right now, the existing votes could have been parted in a different way. The banner is about to fall. I hope it's not going to happen. JKPLV attīstībai par KPLV voters could have been voted different. So competition was harsh. People decided, well, for whom to vote at the very last stage. It was difficult for them to choose for whom to vote, as well as voters voted differently to their previous choices 4 years ago. Another thing that we wanted to learn, who were those people who didn't go to vote, who stayed at home? Which parties were not good enough to persuade their voters to go and vote. And here we can see that only 3 parties couldn't persuade their voters to go and vote, namely Saskaņa's voters. Many of them do not see the essence of elections, as well as KPLV and ZZS voters. All the other parties could have hoped that in the very last moment people will change their minds. They couldn't attract additional votes from those who didn't come to vote, because they have done everything that they could. This is the background information in order to understand how difficult this time was when people wanted change and how the parties regrouped. And now we are going to talk about the important factors when they made their choices.
The first thing that we reviewed, we looked at the informative space during elections to confirm that basically the election campaigns mostly take place in social media, though traditional media also play a certain role. So irrespective of the idea that, people keep using more and more social media, actually we found out that TV was the leading media for provision of information to voters. Internet media were just behind TV, but still had not overtaken TV as a media. And as you see, not so many read magazines or newspapers, which means that the internet portals will play an ever greater role, and Latvia will be following the global trends. What was very characteristic for these elections was that TV and especially debate shows were very, very important. Here you can see the most popular social networks with the Latvian voters. Here, as you see, Facebook is #1. That's a kind of social network that people checked almost on daily basis. But very many people could be reached via advertising in YouTube or some other social networks. And if we arrange various media, including social networks, by the number or the proportion of their audience, then we see quite a promising picture, namely that we do not have one dominating media in Latvia that would dictate the agenda of the Latvian voters. As you see, LTV1, Delphi, LNT, they all have very comparative sized audiences, followed by some other media that also are able to approach the minds and thoughts of the Latvian people. What is new in this campaign is that Facebook was widely used for political advertising. Every second respondent noted that he or she noted political advertising in Facebook before elections. So as you see, this has become a very important communication platform for Latvians. At the same time, you have to look at the importance of social networks in a wider context. And to do that, we ask the voters. To be more accurate, we asked the survey organization to ask the voters about the factors that made voters choose certain parties or certain candidates. For 20% of voters, whatever the parties did, whatever the candidates did in social networks was an important element, an important factor that guided their choice. At the same time, you also see here from these results that opinions of friends, family, as well as political debates on TV played an important role in the choice of voters. So as you see, social media become more and more important for election purposes, but it was still not the only single dominating factor that guided voter choices. So we decided to look at more specific methods in the pre-election period that, in our opinion, were not maybe entirely legitimate, and to what extent they affected the thoughts and minds of the Latvian voters. If you live in Latvia, most probably you have heard about this scandal. Several articles from a newspaper called DNS Business. They were compiled in one larger article, and there were attempts to send this article to almost all voters in Latvia to affect their choices. And we tried to establish how many of the voters received the compiled version of these articles and how it affected their choices. And the result was quite unusual. This publication especially criticized specific parties. And when we look at how the voters who received this publication voted, their choices were not dependent on what was written in the article. And there were two parties that were praised in this publication, namely KPV.LV and Saskaņa. And then, in a way, they maybe profited, especially so Saskaņa, but not the other party, because those who received this publication voted to much lesser extent for this party than general population. With regards to these elections, we tried to review tax advertising or tax reform advertising to show that the tax reform has been successful and that the leading coalition, especially so financial ministers and people in charge of finances, have done a really good job. And we established that approximately 11% of Latvians have seen or noticed these advertisements. And we tried to establish what would be the result if only these 11% participated in the elections. If generally approximately 10% of all voters voted for the ZZS, only 1% of those who had noticed or heard these advertisements voted for this party. So then we have to ask to what extent these advertising campaigns affected the election results, because it seems that the effect was really negative, not positive, not what they intended to achieve. That was about methods. But in addition, we also tried to look at various ideas that were promoted before the election to understand what would stand out as a mobilizing factor to make people vote for totally different parties that they would have chosen before. So one of them was this desire for change, but we tried to find something else. And one of our hypotheses was that maybe a large part of Latvian public harbors this feeling of being offended, of being maybe not respected by those in power. And then we asked them, do you feel, or there was a statement, I feel not respected by the Latvian state. And when I saw the results, they seemed to be very strange for me, because somehow I thought that the voters of the new parties harbored this feeling, and that's why they would choose the new parties. But no, there was no statistical difference. Basically, the dominating source of these bad feelings relies on ethnic considerations, like Russians versus Latvians, because Russian voters told that they hold this grudge to a larger extent than Latvian voters. Also, the next perception that we wanted to test, or the next opinion that we wanted to test, is that voters probably might think that everyone in power is corrupted. So we asked, do you agree that most of those who are in power in Latvia are corrupt? And I was quite surprised by the result, because 69% agreed. Yes, we agree that most of those in power in Latvia are corrupt. So when we look at those who tend to believe this most, there is no direct link with those parties who had these very distinct anti-corruption slogans. These beliefs were mostly held by non-ethnic Latvians, by those who earn less, those who consume less media. So this could be one of the factors why we have so many changes in the Latvian politics. But this is not, of course, a decisive factor, because it doesn't allow to establish statistically significant differences between voters of various parties. The next thing that we wanted to test is to see how radical voters voted, because they were asked a question, or they were given a statement like, do you agree that any change is better than no change? So this is the result that we saw. The statement actually is it's better to have new fraudsters than old fraudsters. So I don't know why the voters for the Progressive Party seem to be eager to confirm this statement or to agree this statement. I think there might be some methodological problems. Maybe we didn't cover them to a sufficient extent. Maybe there's a statistical problem. But generally, it doesn't change the picture. Because if we look at kpv.lv, they have more voters. Basically, the proportion is larger because they would tend to accept even compromising information about politicians coming from this party. But at the same time, 2/3 of the rest of voters that would support this party would not accept any maybe negative news or other type of this kind of information about politicians representing the party. Then we decided to test a very typical assumption that we usually hear before Latvian elections, namely that the voters feel some kind of threats, for example, with regards to future development of Latvia, and this has always promoted fear, let's say, from Russia, or insecurity, or maybe fear of demographic problems, or fear of local Russians or migrants or whatever. And here we see that, yes, for voters of certain parties, this is more distinct, but these differences are not critical. So I believe that a good explanation for these feelings of being threatened or fear, I don't think that this could be used as a factor that would explain why voters voted the way they voted. Then we also wanted to check to what extent voters decided not to come to elections because of aggressive rhetorics against those in power. So we asked, do you believe that some public media treated disrespectfully the voters of certain parties, for example, in relation to KPV-LV and so on? So we cannot really conclude that there is a clear picture here. Yes, on the one hand, the voters of KPV.LV tend to agree a bit more to this statement, but there is no statistically significant difference. What we see demographically, if we look at the respondents in this section or under these questions, and mostly non-Latvians harbor these feelings. So again, ethnic factor. And now about conclusions. Before that, I wanted to underline another important aspect. As I said before this election, the most important thing that took place in the public space, at least according to voters' opinions, was political debates. And this was listened to and viewed in various formats. But what is worrying, we actually have three trends. These debates are watched, followed, whatever, are not of so much interest to the youth, because in other demographic groups, the interest in these debates and the audience was proportionally larger than in the youth group, and they also guided voter choices. What is also very worrying is that non-Latvians watch these debates to a much lesser extent than Latvians, almost 2 times. Maybe because there are not so many debates organized in Russian, or maybe non-Latvians are not so interested in the Latvian politics. And the third trend that I found important is that those who have a lesser education or lower education level and who earn less money, they are not so interested in the debates. So, and when they go to vote, then we have to ask to what extent their decision is well reasoned and well thought over. To summarize what I just explained, I think we have to touch upon 2 aspects. First, why these elections, at least in my opinion, were quite safe from the point of view of possible interference from certain neighboring countries. And the second aspect is possible risk factors for the future. Why I believe that our elections were quite safe? Because there was very very active competition for the voters. Parties tried to attract voters of other parties, but it turned out that only the parties believed that the offer was radically different, because as we see in the post-exit polls, voters could have voted maybe, for 5 parties. And if they had certain doubts, they would choose immediately the other party. And in those segments where the competition was fiercer, the more voters actually arrived to the election offices. What also made our elections quite safe is that our media are not politically concentrated in a way that voters can receive information from a wide range of sources, which means that if one media starts to act strangely or misleads voters or adopts very strict opinions or whatever, this would not affect really the general choice of voters, because voters had access to very many sources. They check internet media, they watch TV or whatever, and if something strange crops up, opinion leaders maybe would notice, but not the regular voter, an average voter. Also, we have now data confirming that social media actually affected or media in general affected the decisions of voters. There are 4 publications, NRA, DNS Business, Diena and Vir, which are the leading publications, leading media in Latvia. If we look at their readers, and basically the choice of the readers was quite similar in all 4 cases. demographic factors were more decisive in this regard than the subscription to certain media. What was also a contributing factor was that we had very many discussions, extensive discussions in many media and social networks and so on, and this prevented illegitimate attempts to affect voter choices. That means that to a large extent the debating activity protected voters from unlawful attempts to interfere with elections. Thinking about future risks, I believe that risk number one, new voters and those who prefer not to use media, those new in the meaning young voters. Approximately 8% of Latvian voters do not use or consume media, even news portals. And this raises concerns because, in a way, yes, they are not very active. They don't want to go to vote, but if they do, they are really ready to believe in various stereotypes. You know, like better young fraudsters than old fraudsters, or Latvian future is at risk, and so on. So if this segment increases, I believe we might see very interesting things happening during next election cycles. Also, I do not think that we'll have as fair competition during next elections than during these elections, because the lesser is the competition, the greater is the possibility that voters not only choose a competing party, but also that they prefer not to vote at all. We could see that very well, for example, in the Russian segment, because people just thought that there's no sense voting at all because nothing will change. What worries me, looking at these surveys, is about opinions of the voters, that so many harbor these negative feelings, that they believe that everyone is corrupt, that any change is better than none. And I think it's dangerous because of two factors. Because it greatly relies on the ethnic factor. Yes, this time the Russian-speaking voters voted either for Saskaņa or the Latvian Russian party, or didn't vote at all. But in other election contexts, maybe this could be used to mobilize voters. And if you do that relying on the grudge, on these negative feelings, it's dangerous. Also, belief in corruption, that is statistically related to insufficient education and low income. So here, it means that we have to fight not only corruption, but we also have to do something to prevent inequality or to reduce inequality, so that people, because of the low income, would not hold this grudge against everyone and believe that everyone is corrupt. That was briefly about our work. You also have materials included in your folders. We think that maybe we will put all the tables received from the SK Day in our homepage, but we have not decided yet what to do. I think we still have time for questions and answers, maybe 10 minutes. So please feel free to ask the questions.
Vai ir kādi jautājumi?
Any questions?
Hello. Puslis. I'm from Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis, and actually what I'm wondering it's about the public narratives that the media constructs. Did you notice any attempts, for example, to put in play some divisive narratives by the media that would shape, that actually on the existing issues, they would shape those narratives so that there would be only black and white divisive things. For example, in Lithuania now we have issues regarding, for example, children welfare, and it's it's a real problem, but it's shaped in a way that it's like you either for family values or you are destroying the values. Or, for example, the recent issue with the immigration pact, which is also framed in a way that it's either you are against immigrants, which means for the nation, or you are like for the destruction of a nation and so on. So it's like, what I wonder is about the role of the media and the attempt to introduce those narratives that would penetrate not only like some one newspaper or magazine that it's published by the particular party, but for example all the media channels, which happens now in Lithuania.
Paldies. I'm going to respond in Latvian because of the audience.
Gunte is going to talk about it in much greater detail after lunch. Our Baltic Center for Media Excellence before elections summoned together directors of all major media, and we were talking about how, for example, Russia could influence our elections, and this acknowledgement, this being aware, protected us against these campaigns that could divide the society of Latvia. And I might say no, that there were no affirmations demanding a black and white picture or a yes or no. Those attempts were there in smaller media in the context of migration. Yes, that's true, but as post-exit poll also indicated, it didn't have any direct influence to our people. So namely, one newspaper might be against migration, but the readers of this magazine were not directly influenced, and that wasn't decisive in their choices. So our media were not so much of dividers of the society. Our media are rather plural, and they are not characterized by attempts to divide the society by asking questions or coming up with assumptions, yes or no, black or white. Any other questions? My name is Ādzeme Davidson from Vidzemes Augstskola, from Vidzemes University. I have a methodological question. These data have been gathered only in the territory of Latvia. Would have been there any changes if you have conducted this survey somewhere in abroad as well? Unfortunately, our companies conducting these surveys cannot achieve the voters outside Latvia, but we are about to publish a survey that was conducted on an internet portal, and there very many Latvians or people representing diasporas from abroad voted, and what influenced them. And it also characterized this, that their point of view is different in some aspects. Namely, diasporas people are very liberal, even speaking about pro-European or immigration. They have less doubt about Europe as such. Also, diasporas people, for them it is important to have clean policy or clean politics, open politics, also equal rights. So it was interesting to know those differences that we can see from people living abroad. Those might be trends that are different, but not so black and white. And what was surprising for me, ideological issues were not decisive for our voters. and that is very interesting. We could determine for whom this person is going to vote by looking at the income, education of this person, region where the person lives, and the age of this person. That was actually the decisive or these factors that how we can divide our society. Any other questions? If everything is clear, then we can get to the second part of our first half of the day. This survey is going to be accessible in Providus webpage as well as in our webpage, namely Baltic Center for Media Excellency. We will decide what we will do with the tables of the survey. We are going to come up with the most interesting trends coming from our diasporas in order to understand what are the peculiarities about their political preferences in comparison with other inhabitants of Latvia. And now I give the floor to Gunta to organize this interactive part. Thank you, Iveta.